Bunjee Venture by Murtry, Chapter 11, Part 2. Bunjee watched the sunrise and heard the distant dawn chorus from the forest on the other side of the plain. He'd been awake for hours. The gnawing, hungry ache in his stomach kept him from sleeping. He waited patiently on the wall for others to wake up. They lay huddled up beside the dead fire, Mr. Winsborrow snoring softly through his thick, matted beard. Bunjee thought wistfully about the eggs that Mr. Winsborrow had spoken of the previous night. Another pang of hunger echoed across his empty stomach. Won't he ever wake up? He thought. He coughed politely. The three figures slept on, so he sneezed a little louder. Achoo! No response. More volume, he thought to himself. Achoo! Andy rolled over onto his side and muttered something in his sleep. Mr. Winsborrow carried on snoring, and all three slept on. This calls for desperate measures, thought Bunjee. I'll give him the Bunjee distress call that I was taught when I was little. He took a deep breath, opened his mouth as wide as he could, which was incredibly wide, and he yelled, "Ya, yang no, priong, yippee, big ho, wang, you're like." Before he was halfway through, the others were up on their knees, wide awake, with their hands clasped over their ears. Andy looked up anxiously at him. Whatever's the matter, Bunjee? You're right? Are you in pain? Oops, I'm sorry, said Bunjee. Did I wake you up? He looked at the three anxious faces innocently. I must have sneezed, he said. Mr. Winsborrow stretched his arms above his head and yawned. That was some sneeze. He got up and wandered across to the cave entrance, where he stood scratching his head and rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Then, after what seemed to be an eternity to Bunjee, he turned and said, well, who's ready for some breakfast? That sounds like a good idea, said Bunjee quickly, as though he'd only just considered it. Oh, Bunjee, Mr. Winsborrow clapped his hand to his head. I'm sorry, you must be starving. No wonder you were making all that noise. Well, hang on. I'll go and see if I can steal those eggs for you now. He picked up a large knobbly club from the back of the cave and strode purposefully out into the sunlight. The children made themselves busy laying some fruit out on a large flat rock that served as a table. 10 minutes later, Mr. Winsborrow staggered back into the cave, carrying 5 enormous eggs. 3 of them were orange-spotted pterodactyl's eggs, and the other 2 were a bright turquoise blue with small flecks of white. These 2 had a thick layer of dust on them. Open up, here comes breakfast, said Mr. Winsborrow. Bunjee smiled happily and opened his mouth. The 3 pterodactyl eggs disappeared in rapid succession. Yummy, yummy, said Bunjee, smacking his lips. Here it comes. My husband's giving me a cup of tea.
Sorry.
It's okay. Thank you. Here comes pudding, said Mr. Winsborrow, picking up one of the turquoise eggs and wiping the dust from it. Bunjee opened his mouth again. Then a startled look spread across his face, and he gave a little cry, shut his mouth like a trap, and fell off the wall onto his face. The other 3 looked down at him in amazement. Whatever's the matter now? Asked Karen. Bunjee staggered clumsily to his feet. Gently, he took one of the blue eggs out of Mr. Winsborrow's hand. He held it up in front of his face, his eyes widening with every second. And at last he spoke. Them's not pterodactyl's eggs, he said. No, said the others. No, said Bunjee. Them's Bunjee eggs. Bunjee eggs? Echoed the others. That's what I said, Bunjee eggs. I found them way at the back of the cave, said Mr. Winsborrow. They weren't with the pterodactyl's eggs. That's fantastic, said Andy. One of your family must have got as far as this place after all, when they all came down the river. Bunjee nodded enthusiastically. How super, said Karen. What are you going to do with them, Bunjee? Bunjee put the 2 eggs into his mouth. His cheeks bulged out like 2 balloons, but he still managed to smile happily. You can just imagine it, can't you? Let me show you a picture. There's Mr. Winsborrow. And you can see Bunjee is on that's just before he fell off onto his face. There's Mr. Winsborrow offering the last 2 eggs for pudding. You're surely not going to eat them? Asked Andy. The reply was a little bit muffled, but they understood him to say that Bunjees always hatched their eggs out in their cheeks. But they're ancient, surely they won't hatch now. Bunjee didn't reply. He just nodded at them all with a knowing smile between the bulging cheeks, as though to say, wait and see. So the children and Mr. Winsborrow ate their breakfast, and when they finished, Mr. Winsborrow said, Well, kids, do you think that you could find the place where your machine is hidden again? I've been thinking about that, Andy said. He pointed across the plain at the front forest beyond. You can't see it from here, but somewhere over there is a break in the forest, a long path that was made by a monstrous animal that forced its way through the trees when we first arrived here. If we run across to the forest and walk along the edge, I'm sure I'll recognise it when I see it. Fair enough, said his father. He picked up his club and took a last look round the cave. Well, he said, shall we go? They all felt tremendously excited. Perhaps soon they would be back in their own time and their own home. They longed to see Mrs. Winsborrow again. She must have given up all hope of ever seeing her children and her husband again. What a surprise it was going to be. Bunjee insisted on coming with them to the forest to see them off, and although it slowed up the perilous journey across to the trees, they were glad of his cheerful company and felt protected by his enormous bulk. In fact, the journey across was instant-free. They saw 2 pterodactyls, but they were far away in the distance, wheeling around the sky like giant vultures. Once in the shade of the giant trees, they rested for a while, then slowly walked along the dead straight line of trunks, hoping to find the opening that would lead them back to their time machine. The children kept looking towards the caves on the far side, hoping that they would recognise their position. Perhaps they were walking the wrong direction. Maybe the path was the other way. 2 or 3 times they came to gigantic openings in the line of trees that must have been made by the same creature, but these swerved either to the right or to the left, and they felt sure that the path that they travelled along was dead straight. It was just when they were sure that they were going the wrong way that they came to it. No mistaking. A great roadway torn through the forest, dead straight as far as the eye could see. Gigantic holes in the ground that had once held the roots of enormous trees. Huge trunks that lay sprawled in every direction. The only difference that the children could see was that the leaves on the trees now were shriveled and hung limply downwards. Eagerly, they started scrambling over the fallen trees, down into the hollows, pushing through the thick dead foliage. They found that they got along a lot quicker when Bunjee inflated his trunk to its fullest extent. In this way, when they arrived at a particularly large tree that had to be climbed over, all they had to do was get together and pat Bunjee up and over as though they were playing with a gigantic balloon. But he was extremely slow when they had to scramble through any thick branches. Getting his huge bulk between some of the narrow gaps was very hard work, and he was terribly anxious not to break the precious eggs in his mouth. When they'd been travelling along in this way for about 3 hours, they stopped for a rest. Karen slumped down onto the ground and rested her back against a branch. The other three leant against a fallen tree, and Mr. Winsborrow wiped his brow with his forearm. "Oh, do you think we're anywhere near the place?" he asked. We must be fairly close," said Andy. "Oh, drat! I wish I'd marked the spot before we left." "Don't worry," said his father. "I'm sure we'll find it soon. I'm afraid I can't help much. Remember, I arrived in the same spot as you did when I first came here, but I didn't have my time machine with me, and I didn't have this long path in the trees to guide me. Things look very different now." Karen got to her feet. "I'm hungry," she said. "I wonder if there are any fruit trees nearby," and she wandered off further down the path. Andy looked across at Bunjee. "You're very quiet, Bunjee," he said. "Anything the matter?" Indeed, Bunjee had been looking more and more downcast the further that they travelled along the path. I'm going to miss you lot," said Bunjee. "That's all." "Oh, don't be sad," said Andy. "We'll come and see you from time to time." Bunjee put on a brave smile. He knew that the Winsborrow family had had a pretty rough time, that really they were only being kind. He felt sure that they would rather do anything than return to this savage place. His thoughts were interrupted suddenly by a sharp cry from further on the path. He looked round. Karen was standing on a large grey rock, waving her hands and shouting excitedly. "She's found it!" yelled Andy. All three started to run, tiredness forgotten. The obstacles in their path were cleared easily as they rushed excitedly to the foot of the grey rock. Sure enough, there it was, just as they'd left it, the clutter of wire and tubes and bits of household paraphernalia, the pieces of carport support, the bread bin lid, all welded together and looking like some mad scientist's nightmare. Andy opened the door. Don't let's wait any longer," he said. "Come on, let's get home." There was a loud sniff. He looked round. Bunjee stood by the grey rock, a large tear rolling down his trunk. They all walked slowly across to him. "Goodbye, Bunjee," Andy said. He squeezed the big creature affectionately. And thanks for everything." "Bye-bye, Bunjee, darling," said Karen, wiping a tear from her own eye. Mr. Winsborrow walked forward, his hand outstretched. He opened his mouth to speak, and suddenly the smile vanished from his face and was replaced by a look of horror, because he wasn't looking at Bunjee now, but over his shoulder. They all whirled around. The grey rock that Karen only moments before had been standing on was moving. It rose over 2 meters in the air, and for the first time they saw that it had a row of sharp, pointed claws and scaly sides. It wasn't a rock at all. It was a gigantic foot, towering above them like an enormous building was a Tyrannosaurus. The foot crashed down again, making the earth tremble. The monster leant forward, opened its throat and gave a tremendous, ear-shattering roar. For a long moment, the four stood petrified with fear. Then Mr. Winsborrow grabbed the 2 children and bundled them towards the time machine. "Come on," he yelled. "Get in." They raced forward. Karen scrambled through the door first, followed by Andy. Mr. Winsborrow had to squeeze into an impossibly small space. He was crouched over the seat, his face pressed against the wall and his knees wedged against Andy's back. Somehow they managed to close the door. Outside, the monster was ripping trees from the ground in an effort to get at them. Great gouts of earth cascaded from the roots and crashed down on the flimsy machine. It was deafening inside. Andy couldn't get his hands to work quickly enough. "Hurry, Andy, hurry!" screamed Karen. Her voice was smothered almost completely by the roar of the monster as it stretched out a huge clawed hand to pick up the machine. The studded seatbelt was in position and they had the little plugs in their ears. The indicator was set for the right time. Andy pushed the final switch. The machine rocked crazily as something hit it hard. The motor noise rose to a shrieking crescendo, and then they heard 2 more noises on the outside metal of the machine. And that's the end of chapter 11. But we know what that sound is, don't we? Tune in for the next chapter. See you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening.